Did you know onions have many uses? Sure, there's nothing better than a fresh onion on a burger in the summer, or a basket of crunchy fried onion rings on the side with a frosty malt. But onions also have a lot of benefits that are often overlooked. Studies suggest eating onions may help reduce the risk of heart disease by lowering blood pressure, managing cholesterol levels, and reducing inflammation. The United States produces about 125,000 acres of onions annually, with California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho leading the charge. Today, we travel to a unique region of New York in the Lower Hudson Valley, just a short drive from the city that doesn't sleep. Helena Representative A.J. Castellini shares insight on how growers in this region produce nearly 292 million pounds of these root vegetables that are loved around the world. Plus, Jody Lawrence joins us from Nashville as we talk about how oil prices are going to impact growers this fall. Join us for this episode of FieldLink. And welcome back to FieldLink. We're excited to have A.J. Castellini. A.J. is a sales representative for Helena, working out of the Woodstown, New Jersey branch in New Jersey, the state of New Jersey. A.J., welcome to FieldLink.
Hey, thanks for having me. Enjoy being out there. We don't get much talk about us over here in the New Jersey area, but there's quite a bit of farming here, and I cover a lot of it. So it's an exciting time.
So AJ, certainly working out of the Garden State of New Jersey, but also covering a little bit of New York. Tell us a little bit about you, AJ. Tell us, where's home?
Home for me is actually right here in Woodstown, New Jersey. I live actually right outside of the branch, about 10 minutes outside of the actual Woodstown location. And I was actually born, raised in the Vineland, New Jersey area, which is a small pocket, well, big for us, but small pocket of farming, all fresh market vegetable production in New Jersey, which, we cover a lot of crops and a lot of diversity there.
Yeah, so you grew up on an operation. I think you mentioned your whole family been involved in agriculture for quite some time.
Yeah, I'm actually a fourth generation farmer. My great grandfather, who actually my namesake, he started farming back in the early 1900s, right around 1910, 1915, in that time frame. And we've been continually farming pretty much the same exact ground for that entire time. I've actually branched out of farming, went to college, did all that, and came back and remembered the only thing I really know how to do is farm. So we got back into a little bit of farming, but mostly got into the production side.
Well, AJ, tell us a little bit about the geography that you cover in the New Jersey market and as well as New York. Tell us about that area.
The big thing about New Jersey is we cover a lot of different crops. We have I had an intern with me one year. He's actually a branch manager now, but he counted all the crops that riding around with me for, I think, about a season. And I think he got up to about 130 different crops, different crop groupings. And it's all fresh market and weird stuff that you would never imagine people grow and eat. But we do it here. And, there's small pockets of it, but as a guy like me, it keeps it a lot really interesting, really enjoyable, because I never know what I'm going to get a phone call about.
You definitely have to be on top of your game with that kind of crop diversity, don't you?
Yeah, well, it takes a long time to understand it, understand what people are trying to grow. I have a funny story about my boss. He went into that market a long time ago. He actually was our sales rep when we were farming, and he got into that market, and we grow dandelion, which everybody wants to kill, you know what I mean? But we eat it, and people do eat it in dandelion salad around here. And the funny thing is, he goes to a farmer and said, hey, and the guy said, hey, I need some recommendations on dandelion. And he was like, well, yeah, 2,4-D, take it right out. You know what I mean? And the guy was like, not to kill it. You know what I mean? I need to grow it to eat it. So that was always a funny story that, a little culture shock for him. but that's what I was raised in and grew. We didn't grow dandelion on our farm, but we grew a lot of different stuff.
Wow.
So it was enjoyable.
Definitely a wide variety of crops, certainly in that geography, and again, I referenced earlier, New Jersey is the garden state, and for a reason, because of that crop diversity that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
AJ, let's talk a little bit about, narrow things down a little bit. You've got a wide range of crops, but one of the unique crops that we all touch is onions, and you're kind of the resident expert when it comes to onions.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in anything, but yeah, I actually took on a territory about 2 years ago now, which I was always familiar with it, just being in the branch and stuff like that. But took on a territory up in Orange County, New York, which is a really, really interesting, really cool place in the Hudson Valley, Lower Hudson Valley, that grows a bunch of onions. I mean, about 5,000 acres, 4,500 acres of onions specifically. But in that territory, there's about 14 to 15,000 acres in one spot. And when I mean in one spot, it is in a tight valley, and the growers there have always been doing the same thing, growing, but they didn't always grow onions. Onions have been in the past probably 35 years. They've grown onions there. Before that, they grew a lot of head lettuce and celery, actually, is what they grew before that. But then the California market kind of picked up around that point, and refrigerated trucks and all that. And so they kind of abandoned that market and then went into the onion market.
Onions have really taken over that valley around Poughkeepsie. Let's talk a little bit about that geography. How far is that valley from, let's just say, for a lot of our listeners, New York City?
Yeah, all right, very, very close. It is about 45-minute drive to New York City from that area, and the predominant market used to be the New York City market. Now has expanded. It has expanded across the country. We go all up and down the East Coast, hit all the big markets, the Baltimore market, the Chicago market, the Boston markets, all the way down south. And these guys are really producing onions for pretty much every onion that you guys see in any grocery store, any chain store, and also in a lot of the chain store restaurants as well.
So I'm sensing a wide variety of onions that are grown in that market, like Vidalias, or is it white onions? Is it everything?
Well, it's actually it's specifically, it's really only two types of onions. Actually, they grow yellow onions, and then they grow reds. There is some guys that are growing some garlic as well, but that's more for a fresh market type sale, going into the green markets, as they call them, which are the farmer markets. But the predominant production is yellow and reds. They tried to grow some whites, but they could never get them as white as they can out in Washington State and some of the other more desert areas. They seem to be, so they kind of abandon that and stick with the yellows and the reds.
So, AJ, I'm not very familiar with growing onions, and I think a lot of the listeners are pretty familiar with consuming them, but not necessarily growing them. Is there a difference on how we would approach raising a red onion versus a yellow onion?
Not necessarily. The nutritional needs are about the same. The disease spectrum is about the same. The maturity is a little bit different. I guess it just depends on the variety as well. Reds usually go in and grow a little bit quicker than the yellows do. But it just kind of depends, but for all in all, we take care of them about the same.
Well, tell us a little bit about that soil profile. I know that area pretty well. I used to work out there, but tell our listeners about that soil in that Hudson Valley.
Well, it's a stark difference than what I grew up on. I grew up on beach sand, as they call it down here. It's a high phosphorus soil down here, and up there it is absolute complete opposite. Now you're talking, it's called the Black Dirt region of the Hudson Valley. It is a black soil, a muck soil, as they call it, 80 to 90% organic matter in that soil. And it is like walking on a sponge. It's the weirdest thing you'll ever see. You can feel tractors 1,000 feet away driving. It's pretty amazing stuff, and you would think it's heavy. It is not. It is like when it gets dry, it's like flour, and when it's wet, it's you can run on it within, I don't know, a day of getting an inch, 2 inches of rain. It's pretty amazing stuff. So, but it does have its issues, and that's where we come in and try to help out with that.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, AJ. How do you interact with your agri-intelligence team and providing maybe some solutions for those onion growers in that type of market?
Yeah, so if we could, the biggest issues that they have with their soil, there's two main issues. Obviously, water management, because the history of that place is it was a prehistoric swamp. So there's a reason why there is a lot of organic matter there. It just was a lot of, 14, 15,000 years ago was a big swamp. And in the 1800s, late 1800s, a guy had a great idea to get the Army Corps of Engineers out there and build ditches. So they built ditches, drained the swamp, cleared the land. And so now they have issues with water. So everything is ditched, everything's tiled, everything is flat and evened out. So they have water management issues, especially during big rains. But the biggest thing that we face on my side is the fact that a lot of these guys, the organic matter is great for growing stuff, including weeds. So they have a big issue with growing weeds. So now what we have done on the agri-intelligence side is not only got into the water management and well water issues because we've been doing a lot of sampling there and kind of doing a series of samples. And I can kind of explain why we do that and why we do a series of those samples. And then the biggest thing is with we haven't gotten high ground or anything up there yet because the soil isn't that variable. But we've been seeing a lot of issues with potash leaching and manganese issues with these crops. And it's been a consistent thing throughout their history. It's just now we're better at taking tissue samples at key times to make sure that we're covering those issues.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine in that market, water being pretty wide and varied. So utilizing tools like AquaLens to help better understand, the quality of water that we're dealing with is very important.
Right. And a lot of those guys have shallow wells, considering, I mean, they don't have to go that deep to find water. The water table, I think, is at any given time anywhere from, let's say, 5 to 20 feet. You know what I mean? It is right up there. Big rains, it's down to 6 inches. But the shallow wells lead to a lot of issues. And we found that out last year. I mean, granted, this is my second full season there, but last year we ran into some issues because we've always buffered our water, but we were buffering either too much or too little, depending on the time of the year. This year, I took a approach where I'm going to take a water sample every month for 5 months in a row during the growing season. And we've actually found out some really interesting things by doing that. This is the first year, and hopefully over the next couple years, we'll get a really compiled data about it. But what we found was that the pH levels in their water and their hardness changes. I mean, and not just by zero point 0.1, by 1 to 2 actual pH percentage points, depending on the amount of rainfall that we've had, droughts. That this year has been a wet year, but last year was a really dry year. So we ran into some issues with pH spiking from a normal, they have higher pH water, around 7, 7.5 normally, but we had pHs spiking around 9. And that's a big difference. It's a huge difference when it comes to spraying, a huge difference when it comes to a lot of things that we're trying to mix in the tanks. So we're trying to narrow that down to understand the best way or the best approach during these times. And the growers are really seeing that because, they were like, how much does it actually change? And we found out that it changes fairly significantly, fairly quickly. So
Yeah, tell us a little bit, our listeners that are, again, not all that familiar with onion production. Walk us through the season. How do you plant onions? How do growers in your area plant them? When is harvest? Walk us through that whole process.
Okay, yeah, it's pretty standard. There is a bunch of little nuances when it comes to how guys plant and their own little specific ways of doing things that work for them. But in general, the biggest thing that they do is they have two main ways of planting. They plant with plants that come out of Arizona that are grown in the wintertime, and they're bare root plants. And then they also have cells, which are kind of the historic transplant cells that have a little bit of soil or soil medium under them. And they usually come out of Canada. And then they also have direct seed. So they're the three ways of planting. So they have a very specific way of, how many plants per acre or per foot to get the size that they're going after. Because obviously, well, maybe people don't know, but big onions are the best onions. So they want the biggest onion they can possibly get. We call them jumbos, and I think it's above a 3-inch onion around, and that's where that's what they're going for. That's what they're shooting for, is those size onions. So last year we had a great year with that. We were grading above 60% jumbos. The season was one of the best seasons that they've had in a long time. Growing wise, this year is actually the complete opposite. So when it comes to planting, that's how they go. They do a lot of in furrow with that, which I know it's surprising to hear people say that because that's more of a corn and bean type thing. But we put a lot of chemistry in that because as soon as those plants go in the ground, they're obviously targets for pests, and their biggest pest in that area is maggots, onion maggot and corn seed maggot. So with actually the ban of a product called Lures ban, we used that. That was their kind of gold standard for those, because it persisted in the soil for a little bit longer and it held them through the season. But now we don't have that. So we've been exploring a lot of different ideas, a lot of different, insecticide uses, a little bit of softer stuff to see if we can really dial that in. And with seed treatments and that kind of stuff as well, they do that as well. So we're just that's kind of like where we're moving in that direction, trying to figure that out as we go along. I've had a lot of steps, in the right way and some in the wrong way, but it's kind of like an exploring for us, trying to figure out what works for us. So that covers planting. Now, once the onions go in the ground, their biggest issue for the first about, let's say 4 to 6 weeks is weed control. So on those muck soils with the 80-90% organic matter, they have a huge issue with herbicides and residuals, because not only is the ground great for growing stuff, it's also great for growing weeds as well, but it's also like a sponge. So any residual herbicide that might work on my soil and I get 2 to 3 month, control on certain weeds or weed spectrum, they do not get. They call them killing the pinheads. So they have to go out and use basically residual post-emergent herbicides quite often just to keep the weed control down. Because if the weeds get out of control there, you might as well just disc up the onions, because there's no point. So that's what we're fighting in season, the first part of that season. Obviously taking care of nutrient management and stuff like that. We use a lot of slow release nitrogen there. Big shots of potash early on. And then through that, after we get through that first 6-week spell, we're trying to obviously limit any fly production, any thrips, and then disease. They get a lot of disease in onions. The biggest one being stemphillium is a big disease that they get there. They also get a bunch of other diseases as well, but we're working towards that later on in the season and start doing our fungicide sprays, start doing our insecticide sprays. So we've made a lot of grounds with that as well. We've been working hand in hand with Cornell up there because they have a really, really good team of pathologists, a really good team of like field scouts and stuff like that, that they like to work, and we kind of work hand in hand. And it's nice because they'll do trials, and I'll bounce ideas off of their people. They bounce ideas off of me, and we kind of work together to try to get to a solution, for these guys. And we've come up with some, and we're still working on a lot of them.
Sure, definitely an evolving area as it relates to production and production management. And as you mentioned, there's probably a lot of different unique products that can certainly, enhance the growth of these onions. Um, AJ, talk to us a little bit about harvest time. Planting. I'm assuming we're, putting onions in the ground in May or late April. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, around April, May. It depends on what the season's bringing. Obviously, we like to be done by the 15th of May. That doesn't always happen, just like anywhere else. I mean, we have water issues, event issues, gets too cold. Now we realize that it's really cold up there. I mean, even me being about 2.5 hours away, the degrees are a lot cooler there. They have a lot colder nights. They're about 10 degrees less than us here in New Jersey, about average. But they have late season. They spring frost all the way to the end of May. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? And that's where you're starting to get some issues there. And that's actually what happened this year. We had a late frost, and it kind of messed up some of the stuff. And, but it is what it is. We work through it. Some of the stuff that, if I don't want to get too far into harvest, because, if I can try to keep it in lineage a little bit, but a lot of the stuff that we're using to enhance production early on is in that in furrow, or they call it a drench. We call it in furrow, they call it a drench. But their drench applications, they historically put fertilizer with that. Now, we've been having a lot of luck over the years with Asset RTU. I'm kind of changing that up a little bit, just as, more just seeing what I can see. And I've made my actually own transplant solution or drench solution that is basically it mimics Asset RTU, but it has double the amount of fertilizer in it for a relatively insignificant amount of more money. I mean, you're talking, I think, $5 an acre more for it, but you're getting double the amount. And growers have really seemed to see the difference in that product as well. So I'm just trying to bring value to them and value to, us, just coming up with something to differentiate ourselves and make something for them that's a kind of a custom blend. The other big thing that they have issues with is manganese early on, just because of those soils. They're actually the opposite of my sandy soils when it comes to either leaching. So we leach nitrogen. Most people leach nitrogen. In those soils, they don't leach that much nitrogen. That's not something that happens there, but they leach potash. So where our soils hold potash, we can put potash on in the fall and have it there in the spring. They cannot do that. They have issues with potash, and which in turn leads to manganese deficiencies as well, because the potash is pulling that with it. So we put some kickstand MN in there in transplanting, and when we're doing that application, so that seems to help give us a nice buzz, nice shot of MN early on. That's safe, and it's really nice because that kickstand line mixes really well with other fertilizers and other chemistry that's going into those blends. So that's what we do for the initial start out. I did mention the weed control issue earlier, but those weeds, it's just a problem with killing them. We're putting a lot of fertilizer on them, on those onions, to get them to grow, and the soil is a great soil for growing, so the weeds just keep coming. So we're looking for we're looking for solutions for doing that and doing a better job. So we use a lot of our surfactant lines, our HPGs. We use a lot of induce and a lot of dynamic up there just to help with that. But we really get into the induce more for fungicides. But one thing that my predecessor found out was that adding Coron to a lot of these herbicide applications really helps kill the weeds without hurting the plants. So so when you're killing weeds and doing the things that you need to do to manage those weeds, we're also hurting the onions when we do that. So we're making secondary scars where we can scar them up, we can twist them up pretty bad. They tend to grow out of it, but we try to mitigate that as much as possible, keep the onions as healthy as we can while killing the weeds. So we use a lot of Coron in that. We use like around 2 quarts to the acre when we're to a gallon is where we go out there with to the acre with those herbicide applications to help penetrate the weeds, kill the weeds, but also not hurt the onions as bad. And then we also follow that up with Megafol and ENC. We use that quite often to help alleviate that stress, give it a little micro pack there. And that seems to help green them up a lot, the onions themselves up a lot, and kind of get them to work out of that stress from those herbicides.
Yeah, that's a great combination when you hit it with that Coron to get that growth, obviously, but then come back, as you mentioned, any herbicide is going to potentially impact a crop, but coming back with a Megafol and ENC combination is a wonderful package to alleviate a little bit of that stress for sure. Let's talk about harvest time. When does harvest take place with onions?
Harvest is right now. We started about a month ago. Harvest is starting right now. So now is the time where, let's see, all of the fruits of our labor have actually paid off. Harvest is pretty interesting out there. They call it hand clipping, which is just hand picking those onions. They send guys out in the field if it's too wet or they think the onions can't handle being run through their machines. And the machines are basically a potato harvester. They got a chain and they go out and lift them with another chain, and then they'll come back and windrow them and then pick them up. But the past couple weeks it's been wet and the onions they can bruise like an apple, like if they get a dent in them or something like that. So they try not to do that. And hand harvesting is a lot easier on the onions. So they do that for a while. And then when the onions kind of harden off, they'll start doing the machine harvest, which is what they're doing right now.
So August, September timeframe is harvest. And I would assume there's certain grades, and I'm not familiar with onions. So is there a grading process for onions? You mentioned bruising that can impact the look, and that's going to impact, whether that sits on a grocery store shelf or goes into a different production.
Right. Yeah. And the biggest thing with these onions is they're stored. So they're a storable product. And going into storage, they'll store them to January, February timeframe. And they have the big storage areas in these onion, and all the farmers have big onion storage areas, and they have fans blowing them all the time. But the grading process is mostly sizing. So what they'll do is they'll run a field run, and you're going to get, whatever, jumbos, mediums, smalls, throughout that. The first process of grading is going to be separating them out. So the first process they run over chains, and the chains are all various different sizes. They shoot them out into different bins, and then they store those bins according to those sizes. So then after that, or while they're doing that, they're also checking for quality. So they're taking out any rotten onions, they're taking out any damaged onions, and then they're kind of going back and putting up a good pack in a box, a big box, like a tote box, and storing them. So they've known they're sized and graded at least once. And what they'll do before actually putting them in the bag is go and resize them again. And then they'll also regrade them for quality again. And sometimes they'll even do that a third time, because as they store, some break down. So they'll keep doing that until it actually gets into a bag. So most of the time it's around three times they go through that grading sizing process. Sometimes 4, just depends on the year and depends on the onion. So this year, this being a wet year for us, they're going to have a bigger and harder grading time just because the quality isn't what it was last year.
That's a lot of handling, a lot of management, clearly. Uh, but AJ, where do these? You touched on earlier your predominant market. It's right there on the coast, but it does stretch out, as you mentioned, even to Chicago from New York State. Are these grocery stores? Are these restaurants? Where do the onions really end up at the end of the day?
Well, they end up everywhere, which is funny. It depends on the grower, and it depends. Some growers are also onion packers as well, so they pack throughout the year, and to satisfy those customers, there's customer needs. They're doing stuff throughout the year to satisfy that. Now they're going to every grocery store that you would probably shop at. I mean, they're going to ShopRites, they're going to Acme's, they're going to Costco's, BJ's, Publix down south. They're going to pretty much everywhere. I know a couple guys have restaurants and big chain restaurants like Chipotle. They're going into the big New York City markets for Fresh Market. They're going to restaurants in there. All basically all these that shopping that they're getting around. So not many go for export like into Canada, but they do get dispersed out pretty much across the United States. And when the Western states, just caveat too is there's a couple other big onion growing areas in the country. Washington State being one, Idaho, and California. New York being the one on the East Coast that predominantly deals with these onions. So they have a working relationship with each other, and a lot of guys go out west to buy stuff, and a lot of guys out west buy stuff from them. It just depends on the season. But the big thing is on the East Coast, there's a lot of people. So out west, there's a lot of people in certain areas, but it's more spread out. We're really concentrated, and we have a big market for, locally in the New York and basically the major cities around that New York State area. So they come down to Jersey, they come down to Philadelphia, they go over to New York, they go to Boston, Chicago, Baltimore. They're running these onions pretty much everywhere.
So AJ, let's fast forward to, we're in season now. What are some of the activities? What's happening in that onion crop in season?
So a lot of things that we're trying to manage in season are insects, especially thrips, obviously onion management. But the biggest issue that we're seeing is disease management. Now, the big disease that's been around for the past, going on 10 years is stem psyllium. And stemphillium for them is a disease that comes in and basically rots down a single leaf all the way into the bulb and creates just a mush of onion. And it can be pretty detrimental disease. So Cornell actually came up with the product, and luckily, we produced that product. It's called Biathon, which is a mix of, phosphoric acid and tebuconazole. So that seems to be really carrying weight with us throughout the season. So we're trying to do this application at least twice, and because that's what the label limits us to. We're only allowed 2 shots at 3 pints. And so when I actually came up and started thinking about is, well, the tebuconazole is what's limiting our applications of the product. Let's see what a trial looks like if we use that phosphoric acid, which is our Prophyte or Reveille, in multiple applications. So what we do is now is we had Cornell do the trial last year, and they came back with really, really good results. That adding Prophyte to your mix with any of your other fungicide applications really increases efficacy on the disease itself. So that's kind of now that's become a grower standard with the production. So we're trying to get, an additional maybe 3 sprays with this Prophyte, sometimes depending on the year, sometimes 4, included with those 2 shots of Viathon. So that's been a really, really big step forward for us for that disease.
Wow, that's awesome. So as you kind of evolve then towards the tail end of the season, getting closer to harvest, what are some activities taking place then?
If you've ever been around an onion field, if you've seen them in pictures, they only show you the ones where they're big and tall and green. But late season, what those onions do is that they actually flop over. They actually lay over, and that's actually when they put on a lot of their size. So the onion will stop taking up a lot of nutrients. That's kind of going. It pulls everything out of those leaves and sucks it down into the bulb. So the leaves actually turn white. They just like it removes everything from them and it goes down in the bulb to make size. So what I've been playing around with, and I have an official trial, and we'll see how that actually turns out. We're going to do a lot of the grading and stuff, but we've been using the product K-Leaf Versa before the onions flop. So before they actually go into that stage, but we can kind of time it, and we do 1 shot at 2 quarts to the acre early on in that like late season flop, like right before that's about to happen. And then we do it 2 weeks after that in another shot of 2 quarts. So what we're hoping to see there is that additional potash with these soils and how they leach potash is that additional late season potash will increase the size of these onions. So it's kind of something that we do in a lot of other crops. We do it in potatoes, we do it in soybeans, for that late season potash. But we're trying to carry that over into onions and see exactly what that does.
Interesting. There's definitely a lot of, I guess, science and art to growing these particular onions.
Right, and the funny thing is, we do both science and art, but when it comes to vegetable production, in general, we look for quality. I mean, because the customers want to eat quality products. I mean, when you go to a grocery store or you go anywhere to buy vegetables, what do you look for? You look for stuff that's dark green, that looks good, that smells good, that has no issues on that, and so what we're trying to do is always increase quality, obviously increase production and size at the same time, but increasing the quality is kind of the art portion of this. So we're always trying to play around with different foliar nutritions, different mixes of different things to increase color, to increase size, to increase overall rigidity of the plant. So we kind of balance between those two things at all times. So, and that's kind of learning from coming from the farm and being in the vegetable production side of things, the fresh market veggies, is mixing a couple of the HPG products together can really get some really good results with, greening up stuff, making it look that deep, dark green. And that's really what sells the product.
Yeah, appearance is definitely an important part for the consumer, especially when you're dealing with higher value added products. AJ, like a lot of different crops, there's always unique trends. What are some of the trends that you're seeing, your growers are seeing as it relates to onions? Is there a bigger demand or a growing demand, for example, for organics?
Yeah, there always is. I've been in this industry for going on 12 years, on my side, obviously farming before that. But over the past 10 years, over the past decade, really, it's been around for quite a while, the organic production. And I deal with a lot of organic production in my New Jersey markets. We do deal with a lot of organic guys there. I have some of the bigger guys in the state. And, that is a trend that we're seeing. Now, if you go to farmers don't necessarily like to change that much. So it's usually forced upon them to change. But they're seeing it. And some of those guys, the more progressive guys, are kind of going that way. We're trying to do a lot of different stuff with fertilizers and using a lot more organic sources of fertilizer. We use quite a bit of pelletized chicken manure in our production, not necessarily in onions, but in my other stuff. And, the need, it's really the thing about farmers is farmers will do what the market is telling them to do because they're going to just move with it. Now regulation and stuff like that has kind of forced their hand a little bit in some regards. But, the nice thing about it is we find solutions. And the solutions, usually, once we figure them out, they might take some time to figure out. But once we figure them out, they actually work better in a way that that the other stuff might have been hurting the crop or stunting the crop in a way where these newer products and the newer things that we're using don't do that. Now, trying to convince a grower to do that, because his grandfather did that, is can get a little bit hard to do. But for the most part, we're seeing them. We're trying different products into these markets. Into onions, we're trying a couple new biologics that have some really big merit, some really good merit, and we're seeing results with them. And it's not necessarily they have to hold their own, so they have to be a good product in general. From at least for me to recommend them, because I don't want to recommend something that's not going to work. But we see that, and the biggest thing that I'm seeing is the compatibility with some of the other conventional fungicides or insecticides that we're using. We're basically alleviating some of those compatibility issues. So it's actually making it easier for these growers to do what they need to do and fit the things in the tank that they need to fit. So we're actually, we're still getting the same results that we would have with some of the other products that we would use, but we're allowing ourselves to not have the issues that we're seeing with mixing some of these products together and phyto issues and compatibility issues. So that's a big win for that direction. So we're excited to explore whatever comes out, and we're trying to implement it as best as we can.
Yeah, we're excited about that too. We're launching a new brand here this fall called Sonics, and I know you're going to be a part of that launch, AJ. Those are the kind of products that are, potentially going to be a nice fit for that type of grower.
Right. Yeah, we're excited to see this new product come out. I mean, at least I am. I mean, in my world, I deal with 100% organic guys, and then I deal with 100% conventional guys. And the funny thing is, about 10 years ago, if you went to a conventional guy and something had an Omri label on an organic label, they just walked away from it. They said, "Man, we don't need that." But now there's what I'm seeing. The biggest trend I'm seeing is that a lot of these products have become very acceptable in both practices, which is great because it leads to, actually they lead to a better farming, more sustainable farming down the road. We're not beating up the ground as much, and then be honest with you, we're coming out with a better product on the other end, in my opinion. So
Yeah, definitely. It spreads out the risk too of, the ecosystem having a little more diversity instead of hitting, the same chemistry year after year after year. We can spread that out and utilize, certain chemistries when we really need it in different spots. So AJ, I want to take this opportunity to thank you again for joining us here today on FieldLink and helping us better understand farming in New Jersey and New York, specifically talking about onions and educating us not only as producers, but also as consumers of those products. And thanks all that you do to help agriculture continue to grow.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate the time that you guys set out for me. If anybody wants to reach out to me, they can. So I'm all over the place. So thank you, and I appreciate it.
Thanks, AJ. And now we travel to Nashville to catch up with Jody Lawrence. Jody, quite a lot going on in the grain markets right now. Certainly a lot of things impacting from the global side. We've talked a little bit about Russia and some of the China supplies, as well as the BRICS situation, meaning India, China, and Brazil all kind of teaming up. Not to mention crude oil hitting some highs here. Jody, welcome to FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill. It's good to be back. Hope everybody had a good long Labor Day weekend as we kind of bid adieu to the summer of 23. But a lot going on, and start with the last thing that you mentioned. Crude oil is beginning to has moved out to new 2-year highs, and the energy sector along with it. When you look at diesel, you look at unleaded gas, and natural gas is now starting to break out a little bit. And all of those things, obviously, you're looking at input costs and what could be for upcoming fall fertilizer and then planting 24 needs. So, and I'm keeping a particular eye on nitrogen prices as natural gas affects that. So might certainly be a good time right now, right before you start having to work 24/7 during harvest, to do a little work on talking to your salespeople, figuring out what the prices are. And if you're on the wholesale side, filling up a couple sheds, probably not a bad idea. And if you're on the production side of it, getting some really early prepay done before we know what inevitably can happen as you head into the winter, like we saw since the Ukraine invasion, if natural gas decided to take off, and certainly could add 20-30% to price without much issue, then that would it cuts into those margins. And especially when you're looking at December 24 corn, just barely over $5, we're going to have some sharp pencils for 2024.
Yeah, Jody, as we take a step back and take a look at the overall supply for energy, the U.S. keeps depleting, that reserve, but, hoping that, that will impact, the overall price at the pump, if you will. But that's really not turning out, is it? As Saudi Arabia decides to shut their spigots off.
Yeah, we're caught in a battle with normal U.S. consumption, that it was one of the rare summers, and certainly since we've reopened for COVID, where there were less miles driven this summer in the last study that I saw of it. So you do have some decreasing U.S. demand, and obviously China's economy has not caught the traction yet with their economic stimulus packages and their changes to COVID policy since the beginning of the year. But Saudi Arabia and OPEC have the giant hammer in this. If they decide to trim production, there's not a lot everybody else can do, because due to EPA regulations, very difficult for the U.S. to just go to make up a like amount to keep prices level. So it's the energy thing is something I'm going to be watching closely through the fall and winter. And obviously that bleeds over into costs and expenses for just about everything else.
That's right. And, every consumer's feeling that at the pocketbook as they pull up to the pump, for sure. Jody, weather continues to be pretty warm across most of the U.S. We had some record temperatures over the last week or so, continue to impact at least what could be some top-end yields. What are you picking up from your customers as you chat with them over the weekend?
I got a few emails and texts over the weekend, especially when you start talking about Western Corn Belt and, similar situation to last year. If you take the Western Corn Belt, basically is from Des Moines west, and you start getting west of Des Moines, and their crop is not in Nebraska, the Dakotas, Kansas, not finishing well. This is going to end up being, in several areas, even a drier and hotter year than 2012 was. And early harvest, dry down, kernel depth, all of these things that will figure into final yield test weight for how the USDA moves looking forward, that we could really start harvest a lot earlier than everyone expected. And I've had a couple people tell me that they'll start about the same time that they did for 2012, which is crazy to me to think that we still have, due to the improved genetics and practices and everything, that the USDA is still firmly holding over a 170 yield when the yield in 2012 was 125. So it's going to be interesting. The difference this year, it looks like the bean crop's going to hold up a little bit better than it did, but certainly this hot, dry stretch, this flash drought to end the season since the middle of August in the record heat, if you bookend how this crop started and how it's finishing, you certainly understand why the crop ratings are so low, and that the USDA could be giving us a shock as they get into their October and then January final reports. Not expecting too much on the September 12th report. I think that's a week from today. And there'll be several private estimates out this week. I think StoneX will be out with their first one. Certainly, corn yield moving back down under 173 seems like the most obvious guess. Whether they take beans under 50 bushels an acre yet is unsure. But the thing that the Pro Farmer Tour made an assertion about was that there were 600,000 more acres of corn than what the USDA reported in their June 30th report. So I will be closely watching that, because if the USDA comes in and sticks with their numbers that they've gotten from the FSA and everybody else who accumulates data for them, that if that number stays right, and they trim it by 1 bushel, you immediately take out, let's see, that'd be 85 million just on the 1 bushel, and then 600,000 acres that, just call it 170. There's, just between those two cuts, you could easily trim 500 million bushels off, and nobody would be terribly surprised. And that would certainly build a base under prices as we're sitting just here dragging along, between 480 and 490 on December 23 corn. Talked to several other people, analysts in this business I've known a long time. And at the beginning of the year, had you told us, yes, this is potentially a 172, 173 crop and an under 50 bushel beans, we would expect it to have much higher prices, corn much closer to 6 and beans well over 14. But that's just not the way the market is reacting right now, because you just have what is seemingly, it's opaque on how big their crops are. But when you look at the record production that came out of Brazil in both corn and beans, and Russia in wheat, they're still selling their record harvest from last year, just as they're on the verge of planting another one, potentially record crops. So a lot of competition for demand right now. And what we need to see, the biggest thing is, I saw another sale probably to China of beans this morning, but everybody needs to see China's economy begin to really fire back up, because if their economy comes back, their demand will come back right at a time when we need it.
Yeah, and it's not being very public, but it sure feels like the economy in China, for the average Chinese person, it's not great. The demand at the home front there, they're having tough times over there.
Yeah, the food inflation, when you've got rising inflation for your basic necessities and a slow economy, really puts puts a pinch on everybody. And I will be curious. China's always been historically very good at being able to get their population fed and control internal inflation. But this year they're just having a little more trouble because they're battling a poor economy, some bad decisions during COVID, and just expectations are not being met on how quickly those stimulus packages were going to rebound the economy.
Yeah, the average diet in China has definitely shifted over the last 20, 30 years, and their hunger for protein is very high compared to what it was traditionally. So certainly going to create some chaos in that market as well. Jody, speaking about the global side of things, BRICS was just recently, that took place. Tell us a little bit about BRICS and what kind of results that might impact growers here in the U.S.
Well, BRICS is the acronym for the summit and the alliance between Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And obviously, we've already spoken about Brazil and Russia from a competitive standpoint. And when you talk about India, we've not mentioned that they are banning exports of wheat domestically that they grew, and also rice. So when you talk, you look at the big picture of where everybody lives these days. You've got over 3 billion people between China and India, with India growing and expected to pass China as the most populated country within the next decade. And India has to be involved in this alliance. Simply, first of all, they share a border with China from a safety perspective, but they're also looking ahead at the same issues that China was thinking about 15, 20 years ago when they got Brazil in their back pocket to be able to produce all of the corn and beans that they needed to help feed their population. So India is getting involved in this with Brazil, with Russia, to go where the biggest availability of extra bushels is going to be. And that's why, while India may not seem like an obvious fit, because they are a democracy, although their dietary kind of balance is certainly different on a protein side, since they are not generally a meat-eating country, that you have India in political discussion and with both Russia and Brazil and China, that makes everybody in the U.S., when you start talking about the big picture potential problems of their alliance coming together, that the U.S. would have to figure out a way either to dramatically improve relations with Russia and China, but also be able to compete at a level with Brazil, without Brazil just continually expanding by millions of acres every planting season. So the BRICS thing is going to be important to watch. It's definitely a story that's become more important over the last 2 to 3 years. And just it's something that, if you are politically involved, keep in touch with it. Write some letters to your congressmen and women that we need to improve relationships with those countries so that we can improve our exports. Because it's like we talked about earlier, you look at the dismal export pace for corn, even as we start a new marketing season on September 1st for corn and beans. But last year's, was nearly 750 million bushels below expectations. And that number, if it carries over for a couple of years, you've got a whole lot of stocks that somebody's got to get rid of.
Yeah, definitely a group that we really do need to keep an eye on. And, that goes to the fact, too, you just think two of those countries that are part of that alliance, India and China, you mentioned earlier, 3 billion people. There's 9 billion in the world. That's 33% of the population around the globe are sitting in those two regions. And that's certainly going to drive demand for whatever crop it is.
Yeah, it's just you can't ignore who your customer base is, and increasingly it is going to be it's going to be Asia, and we're going to have to be able to address it. And while we're in good relationship with India, we also have to realize that they have food inflation, and they have their priority is going to be feeding their population at the cheapest price or the lowest price possible. And they will be, if their consumption continues to outpace their production, they're going to have to develop a closer alliance with both Russia and Brazil to be able to control their food inflation.
Jody, want to thank you very much for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink and bring us up to speed on some of the global front as well as some of the local markets here in the U.S.
All right. Thank you, Bill. It's always good to be on. And we'll do a follow-up to the September 12th report. We'll have a lot to talk about the next time we get together.
You bet. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode.